Hello my dear friends, you're in the middle of a summary channel. In this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where the Russian ceasefire continues. Today is the 10th of May of 2026, which means that there are a bit more than 24 hours left before the end of this ceasefire. And of course the most important question that many people has right now, whether the Russians and the Ukrainians, and of course with the help of the United States of America, will continue this ceasefire, or this ceasefire will end within the next 24 hours and both the Russians and the Ukrainians will begin bombing and attacking each other with hundreds of missiles and with hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles, and whether the Russians and the Ukrainians will continue their offensive operations along the line of combat contact. As for the Kremlin, as for the Russian side, we see that it seems that there are very small chances that the conflict could be ended even tomorrow during the 11th of May of 2026. At least we can make this conclusion based on the statements that were made by the president of the Russian Federation. And for example, the Russians stated that they are waiting for the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, in Kiev. There was no specific message from Zelensky. I heard against that Zelensky is ready to hold a personal meeting. We have never turned that down. Anyone who wants to meet can come to Moscow. We could meet in a third country, but only after final agreements have been reached for the long term. So as you can see, the Russians, more precisely the president of Russia, Putin, and the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, can have a meeting in two cases. The first one, Zelensky can come anytime to Moscow and he can meet with Putin anytime he wants, probably. And the second option is to meet on the territory of a third country, as for the third country, Putin and Zelensky can meet, but only to finalize everything. So but Putin is trying to tell us that if Zelensky comes tomorrow to Russia, to Kremlin, then most likely the Russians and the Ukrainians can continue the ceasefire or something like this. But the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, rejected this idea. He said that this is impossible. Zelensky is ready to meet with Putin anywhere but not in Moscow, advisor to the head of the president's office, Lyshenko. Moscow is the capital of the aggressor state. Such a format of negotiations is impossible. But you know that recently Zelensky has made a very interesting situation. He adopted a law that allowed the Russians to have the parade on the territory of Moscow. So it seems that Zelensky may do the same thing here as well. He can adopt another law which will allow him to have a meeting with Russians and with Putin personally on the territory of Russia, and this won't mean anything. So Zelensky can do this, so everything is possible once again within the next 24 hours. But as of the situation, if the ceasefire doesn't extend that, in this case, of course, most likely both the Russians and the Ukrainians will continue attacking each other. Most likely we'll start receiving first reports somewhere in the evening of the 11th of May of 2026, and we're talking about launching of hundreds of drones, and somewhere at 12 a.m. of the 12th of May of 2026 we'll start receiving first updates about drones and missiles probably crossing the line of combat contact in both directions, in the direction of Russia and of course in the direction of Ukraine. But as for the ground operations, these days we start receiving lots of interesting updates from the Zaporizhzhia direction. Once again, pro-Ukrainian sources stated that the Russians are regrouping massively in this area during these days of ceasefire. Lots of Russian soldiers and forces were recorded around the city of Tokmak, around the settlement by the name of Melitopol, and in the area of the city of Berdyansk. So this is the main Russian military triangle, and the Russians, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, are finishing regrouping in this area. And according to information we have, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, after the end of the May's ceasefire, the Russians will begin their major offensive operation in the direction of the city of Zaporizhzhia. But as for this possible offensive operation, of course, we remember that these days we were receiving lots of updates about an offensive operation, but we were receiving updates about the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation that has been taken taking place since the beginning of May of 2026, and as of this counteroffensive operation during the previous 10 days, the Ukrainians managed to improve their position significantly, and the Ukrainians have almost managed to force the Russians to fall back from the settlement of Stepnogorsk. Probably there are very heavy clashes right now. Maybe the Russians are finishing regrouping with the purpose to begin the Russian counteroffensive operation, or maybe the Russians have finished regrouping because they see that the Ukrainians have finished the regrouping in this area as well, and if the Ukrainians continue, maybe the Ukrainians are able to return much more territories that they have already returned. Another important situation, we understand that the 9th of May, 10th of May and 11th of May are pretty calm days. So we see that both the Russians and the Ukrainians are trying to follow the ceasefire that was announced by the President of the United States of America. So that is why we don't have lots of updates when talking about the situation on the ground and so on. But we have some interesting updates that worth attention. For example, during the 9th of May of 2026, a very interesting video was published by pro-Russian sources, and here we can see a very long video where we can see how the units of the Group of Forces West were publishing and raising flags in different parts of the Barovo-Kupiansk direction. Lots of episodes, as you can see, were recorded, lots of Russian soldiers, lots of places and buildings where the Russians raised their flags, and we have a video, we have an episode where the Russians raised their flag in the northern parts of Stavki, but here we have nothing new, nothing special. The territory have been already colored in the Russian favor. We have a video from an episode from the central part of Yarovo, which is a also very interesting situation. We have a video, an episode from the area of the settlement of Karpovka, but when talking about these flags, we see we have no changes. But there was two flags that were raised in the most western parts of the Luhansk region. So, and this is the situation between the dates. This is the end of the 9th of May and this is the end of the 10th of May. If you remember, several weeks or even months ago, the chief of the general staff of the armed force of the Russian Federation, Valery Gerasimov, stated that the Russians finished the battle for the Lugansk region and that the Lugansk region was completely taken by Russians. And if you remember, based on that report that was made by the chief of the general staff, we adjusted the map and we added both yellow and red colors over the western part of Lugansk region, because of course the report was made by the official Russian source, by the Minister of Defense and by the Chief of General Staff, but we know that the clashes for these western parts of Lugansk region has been taking place almost since the beginning of the special military operation, so that is why we decided to wait a bit more and to wait for videos and geolocations that could confirm this information. And this video was published yesterday as we discussed, and based on this video we have adjusted the map, the most western parts of the Lugansk region. As of the end of the 10th of May of 2026, we may say that indeed most likely the Russians, as a result of clashes, as a result of the conflict with Ukraine, managed to establish probably still almost complete control over the Lugansk region, probably 99.99%, but obviously the Russians most likely are about to establish full, maybe have already done this. Anyway, we have adjusted the map based on these videos, and we see that the Russians continue their offensive operation in the Barovo direction. Another important video is coming from the settlement of Pryshyb, and these are the changes on the ground. If you remember, before the beginning of May's holidays, we received lots of updates from the area of the settlement of Pryshyb and Katerinovka. We discussed the situation many times, that the Russians managed to cross the Seversky Donetsk River and to answer both villages, Tatianovka and Pryshyb, and to improve their position significantly. And today, during the 9th and during the 10th of May of 2026, we received another video from the settlement of Pryshyb, where we could see how the Ukrainians were bombing positions of Russians on the territory of settlement. So we received the fourth proof that the Russians indeed have more or less strong control over the territory on the Ukrainian side of the river to the north of the city of Sloviansk. And this foothold obviously opens the Russians the way to attack the Slavs from behind, and which is very, very bad for the Ukrainians, and something that the Ukrainians obviously obviously didn't expect and don't want to be developed further. So this is the situation. This is the situation right before the last 24 hours before the end of the ceasefire. We believe that tomorrow we'll see lots of updates, and we'll see that most likely tomorrow the conflict will continue. And despite the request from the Russian side that the Russians are ready for negotiations with both the Ukrainians and the Europeans, we received the report that the Germans rejected the proposal that was made by Russians. Yesterday, Putin proposed to have former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, as a mediator in Ukraine. But today we received the report that the federal government of Germany rejected Vladimir Putin's proposal that former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder act as a mediator in Ukraine. So, which means that Europe is still not ready for the negotiation process, or they want to use somebody in this process that most likely is not or completely unaccepted by Russians. And that's it for the short today's video of the 10th of May of 2026. It's the military summary channel reminds to weaken the many violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.